My mother told me about an incident that happened to her when she was a little girl during the Great Depression. She never forgot it, not even for a second, and she often said it felt like it happened just yesterday. The story always stuck with me too. It was one of those things you can't shake, no matter how hard you try. Back then, my great-grandmother lived with my mother and her family. They lived in a tiny town that was mostly farmland, with a railroad track that ran through the middle. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and life moved slow, like the days were too tired to hurry. One day, a man came to visit. He was the boyfriend of one of my mother's aunts, a man who worked as a used car salesman. He had just made a big sale, and feeling generous, he decided to celebrate. He handed my great-grandmother a $20 bill and told her to go buy something nice, anything she wanted. In those days, $20 was a fortune. It was like $2,000 to some people. It might not seem like much now, but back then it was a kind of wealth that could change your day. Excited, my great-grandmother decided she would take my mother with her to the grocery store. It wasn't far, only about a mile away, but it felt like a small adventure. My mother remembered how she held her grandmother's hand as they set off, the dust from the dirt road sticking to their shoes. The sun was high in the sky, but the air had that heavy, humid feel, like it was waiting for something. When they arrived at the store, there were two men standing outside. They looked rough, grimy clothes, faces hardened by years of hard living. But my great-grandmother barely paid them any attention. After all, they were just two men in a small town. She and my mother picked up a few things for the family. Some sugar, flour, maybe a tin of canned peaches, and walked up to the counter. As she handed over the $20 bill to the clerk, my mother remembered how the two men outside seemed to be watching them now. They stood there in silence, their eyes following her grandmother's every move. When the change was handed to my great-grandmother, one of the men stepped closer, just enough so she could see the glint of his eyes, and his gaze dropped to the money in her hand. It made my mother's stomach twist, though she didn't know why. It was the way his eyes seemed to linger, like he was memorizing every detail of that $20 bill. Like he could smell it, taste it, know how badly he wanted it. But she and her grandmother left without saying a word. The air outside felt cooler now, and the shadows were getting longer. As they began walking back, the quiet of the countryside stretched out around them, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet of before. As they passed the old cornfield near the edge of town, my great-grandmother suddenly stopped. Her grip on my mother's hand tightened. She glanced over her shoulder, her face paling as she scanned the dirt road behind them. My mother could feel the change in her, a shift that seemed to make the air grow colder, heavier, like a storm was about to break. That's when she saw it. A pickup truck, old, battered, with peeling paint, crept down the road. It had no headlights on. It was dark by now, and my mother's heart began to pound in her chest. The truck didn't seem to be in a hurry. It moved slowly, almost casually, as if it had all the time in the world. But the thing that made her blood run cold wasn't the truck itself. It was the way it followed them. It didn't pass. It stayed behind, trailing them down the road. "Stay quiet, child," her grandmother whispered urgently. "Come with me." Without a word, they ducked into the cornfield, the stalks scratching at their legs as they moved deeper into the rows. The sound of the truck's engine grew distant, but my great-grandmother's eyes never left the road. They crouched low in the dirt, the cold earth pressing into their knees as they waited. My mother could feel the tension rising in her grandmother's body. The older woman's breath came fast, shallow, and her hand gripped my mother's with surprising force. "Stay low, don't make a sound," her grandmother whispered. They crawled deeper into the cornfield, the rustling of the stalks growing louder, more frantic. My mother could hear the truck now, its engine revving as it came closer, the crunching of tires on the gravel road making her heart beat faster. She could feel the weight of something terrible looming over them, a darkness that crept closer with every passing moment. Then there was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. Someone was walking toward them. My mother barely breathed. She could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears as the footsteps got nearer. She wanted to scream, to run, but her grandmother's hand kept her in place, kept her silent. Through the corn, she saw shadows moving. There were two of them, menacing shapes cutting through the tall stalks, their silhouettes jagged in the dim light. One of them was carrying something, probably a flashlight, though my mother wasn't sure. The light flickered wildly as it moved, sweeping across the field in frantic motions, like they were searching for something, someone. Every rustle of the corn seemed amplified now, as if the field itself was alive and betraying them. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she tried to stay as still as possible, hoping they wouldn't see her. But the lantern, or was it a flashlight, kept moving closer, the light sweeping just inches from where they crouched. For what felt like hours, they stayed there, frozen in place, barely breathing. My mother remembers the faint smell of dirt and sweat, the taste of fear hanging in the air between them. The two men kept searching, their voices low and gruff, their words indistinguishable from the wind. After what felt like forever, her grandmother finally whispered, "We have to move. We have to go home." My mother nodded, too frightened to speak, too afraid to make a sound. They crawled out of the cornfield and moved swiftly, quietly toward home. The truck was gone now, its engine fading into the distance. But the fear didn't leave. It clung to them, wrapping around them like a thick, choking fog. They made it back to the house, where my great-grandmother locked the door behind them and didn't speak a word. My mother lay in bed that night, her heart still pounding, her mind haunted by what might have happened if they hadn't escaped. In the days that followed, the newspapers reported a string of robberies and assaults. People attacked for a few pennies or a couple of dollars. But it wasn't until years later, when my mother was much older, that she realized what could have happened that night. The two men, those rough strangers, had followed them for a reason. They had seen the $20 bill, and they had been willing to do anything to take it. My mother always crossed herself when she told this story, shuddering at the thought of what might have happened to a little girl and her grandmother, alone in that dark cornfield. She never let go of the fear, the lingering sense of dread that came with it. It was as if something had been waiting for them out there, something dark and hungry, and they had narrowly escaped its grasp. And whenever I hear this story, I can't help but feel the same chill, that same creeping terror. It never goes away.